The Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, apparently, according to the Premier, Michelin had nothing to do with their own success, which I'm sure will be news to the workers and the people of Michelin, which is a worldwide success story. Investing in plants all over the world, except for the ones here during his term as Premier. And the question is why? Mr. Speaker, when Michelin does so well everywhere else, Nova Scotians, particularly those in the Annapolis Valley, are still waiting 125 days to find out why those jobs aren't coming here. Mr. Speaker, in fact, if the Premier wants to look around him, 688,000 full-time jobs have been added everywhere in Canada except Nova Scotia under his term in office, where we're down 7,400 full-time jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, here is a suggestion, a cost-free way to make Nova Scotia attractive again for Michelin, for all kinds of other companies. Will the Premier reconsider his first contract law now and send a signal, a cost-free signal, that this can be a good place to create jobs again?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the simple reality of the situation is, and Statistics Canada, even the most recent Statistics Canada show that there are 7,600 more jobs in Nova Scotia than there were when we came to power. From the peak of the recession to the peak employment pre-recession till now, we have more jobs in Nova Scotia, despite the fact that our economy, just like economies around the world, have been battered by some of the strongest economic recessionary pressures in the history of modern society, Mr. Speaker. We have managed through those. We have grown the economy. We've won the largest industrial contract in the history of the province. We're building our way into energy self-sufficiency, and we're bringing 440 new engineering jobs to the province, just announced today.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During an October 18, 2011 meeting of the Economic Development Committee, it was decided that a tour of the DSME facility would be arranged. This was enthusiastically agreed to by the government members who had the utmost confidence in DSTN investment at that time. We have yet to have the tour and repeatedly are told it's not possible due to scheduling conflicts. However, on December 16, 2011, DSME announced 40 layoffs. So my question to the Minister of Economic Development: did the Minister know about the pending committee tour, and did he express concern to the Chair regarding a visit to a facility destined for layoffs and diversification?
Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've toured DSTN prior to DSTN and certainly after, and it was just such a nice positive result to see the before and after, Mr. Speaker. I would never, nor have I ever, interfered with anything that, with respect to a planned tour of any facility in the province of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on December 18, 2011, there were 40 layoffs announced at DSME Trenton. On May 25, 2012, another 26 people laid off. We have seen media reports saying 70 people are employed at the plant. In August, the minister said approximately 66 people were now employed. Just last week, he said there were less than 60 at DSME Trenton. This minister said he gets daily briefings from the company, and given his government's commitment to create 500 jobs, I would hope he routinely asks about the current levels of employment. So my question to the minister, based on his DSME briefing today, will the minister tell us how many people are working at the site today and when the plant is expected to hit a workforce of 500 people?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, DSTN is an active plant. They're looking at more global markets. They're expanding their market strategy. They're reaching out. They're reaching out to other markets, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, we are patient here. We along with the federal government, when we first were approached and we approached DSTN, unlike other governments, Mr. Speaker, we didn't sit back and wait for things not to happen, Mr. Speaker. We go out and we make things happen, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to media questions regarding DSME, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism said, quote, "I don't see how the fact that we've invested in a company, I don't see where that gives them an advantage over other companies," end quote. The minister went on to say, quote, "They've got every right as taxpayers, as a business, to compete," end quote. I will remind the government side that the minister is responsible for an annual budget of $187 million of taxpayers' money and is supposed to be the brainpower behind economic development initiatives in this province. Given the magnitude of his portfolio, it is alarming to learn that he doesn't understand the basic fundamentals of competition. So my question on behalf of taxpayers, small businesses, the private sector, economists and business professors everywhere, how can the minister justify his position on DSME that receiving $60 million and being 49% government-owned does not give DSME an advantage over local companies who pay for their salaries and expenses with their hard-earned business revenues?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, DSTN, and it's DSTN, like any other company in the province of Nova Scotia, have every right to have the same opportunities that other Nova Scotians have when it comes to bidding on contracts. Mr. Speaker, we have a fair, transparent procurement process here in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's about fairness. We've created jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. You heard the Premier earlier today talk about engineering jobs, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we create jobs from everything from the individual that's going to carry the briefcase to the person that's going to get an engineering degree, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe my comments today may surprise the members of the NDP government. I rise today in my place to commend the Minister of Economic and Rural Development on the success of his Jobs Here program. Under this minister's watch, Mr. Speaker, 13,019 Nova Scotians have found good paying jobs in Alberta. The reality is, while this minister likes to claim the Jobs Here program has been a success, the numbers say different. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is this. When does the minister plan to rename the Jobs Here program and instead call it the Jobs Alberta program? At least that way, when he calls a program a success, he'll be able to claim this with truth in his voice.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am surprised that a member of the third party, the previous government, that left this province in such a mess, a total mess. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Despite that mess that we inherited from that bunch over there, Mr. Speaker, we've created 7,600 jobs in this province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
And you know, it is obvious to me, and I'm sure to other members of the House, that this government has been in power for 3 years. They can't fix the problems that they say that was created by others. It shows that they don't deserve to be in government. And Mr. Speaker, when you talk about 7,600 part-time jobs, that's not good enough for the people of the province of Nova Scotia. Southern Nova Scotia has lost 7,500 full-time jobs, Mr. Speaker. On the South Shore, the workforce has decreased by 3,800 people. In Cape Breton, 300 full-time jobs have vanished under this NDP government. Yet despite this, the Premier told the members of this House of Assembly job growth is growing in the right direction, and I want to table that. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is entitled to his own office, and he's entitled to his own staff, but, Mr. Speaker, he's not entitled to his own facts. And the fact of the matter is that more than 13,000 Nova Scotians are working in Alberta proves that this Premier is wrong. Could the Minister of Economic and Rural Development offer some clarification on behalf of his boss? With over 13,000 Nova Scotians working in Alberta, when the Premier says job growth is going in the right direction, does he mean westward?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we came into to government, do you know what? There was a problem. There was a problem in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know on this side of the House, the people on the outside of the House know what the problem was, Mr. Speaker. And it's right over there, Mr. Speaker. It was that bunch over there, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Yeah, it is getting a little loud in here, so I'd remind it's getting a little bit heated in here, so I asked all the members to take a deep breath so we can continue the debate in this chamber in a nice parliamentary way. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, is that when we came into government, there was a trend. There was a trend of people of out-migration. Mr. Speaker, but we are changing that, Mr. Speaker. We are changing that. We are turning the corner. We've got things on the horizon, Mr. Speaker, that are game changers that no other government before us has ever realized. These are things that are going to, once in a lifetime, these things happen, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? One would say that luck has a little bit to do with it. And you know what? They may be right to a degree. But I would also say good, hard, honest work has a lot more to do with it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Speaker, and it surprises me that DSTN doesn't have any orders for their wind turbines when you consider the wind that's coming from that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, here's an interesting fact. 13,019 is the number of Nova Scotians that are working in Alberta. It also falls within the 25% variance for Nova Scotia's new electoral boundaries. Now, since the Minister of Economic and Rural Development will not take the right steps to ensure that those 13,000 men and women are able to find good-paying jobs in Nova Scotia, maybe he at least could do them the favor by letting them play a role in firing the NDP government here in Nova Scotia. Now, my question to the Minister is this. When will the Minister urge his would-be gerrymandering colleagues to establish the new constituency in Nova Scotia Gone West so that those... Oh, I have no problem slowing down. When will the Minister urge his would-be gerrymandering colleagues to establish the new constituency of Nova Scotia Gone West so that the more than 13,000 Nova Scotians working in Alberta will at least be able to properly voice their displeasure with this NDP government?
I would remind the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West that the impunitive motive during question period is unparliamentary. So I would ask the Honourable Member if he would retract that, please. Gerrymander.
No problem. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd be glad to do that.
Thank you.
And I'd like to repeat my question now.
No, I get the honourable question to the Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we recognize on this side of the House that we are doing a lot of the right things. We are doing things under the PIP initiative, Mr. Speaker, where we are investing in companies, we are investing in peoples, we are becoming more innovative, we are becoming more productive, and we are becoming more competitive on a global basis. Mr. Speaker, if I may, and I'll try not to be too long, I want to read something from the Herald today, Mr. Speaker. And you know, I'm going to read from this. The region of Queens is seeing phenomenal growth, despite the closure of the community's main employer. Not one business has closed as a result of Bowater's shutdown. Just the opposite has happened. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are some members that don't like to hear this, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you this is what Nova Scotians want to read.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is to the Minister of Economic Development. Mr. Speaker, while this NDP government is giving away hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate handouts, something I might add they were vehemently against in opposition, the unemployment rate in Cape Breton is well over 16%. If it weren't for the Cape Bretoners who are working out west, the unemployment rate would be double that number, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 16% unemployment rate is 6.5% increase from last year and 20% higher than it was in 2009. Mr. Speaker, why is this minister, it's a strange thing, Mr. Speaker. Every time I mention the shortcomings of this government, I get the attention of the Premier. Are you finished, Mr. Premier?
Order, please. Order.
Mr. Speaker, why is the Minister of Economic and Rural Development like... I don't know, he's the one that should be out of here.
There's nobody getting out of here, but once I say order, all the mics are turned off, so... Okay, well, now I'm going to recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton South to continue.
Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is why is the Minister for Economic and Rural Development Tourism handing out hundreds of millions to large corporations who lay off workers while he ignores economic development in Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've made huge investments in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker, and I think one just has to remember what happened very recently with NewPage. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that the Liberal Party may not want to recognize the investments that we made in NewPage, Mr. Speaker, because they didn't want us to make that investment, Mr. Speaker. We invested in those families and those individuals in that community because, Mr. Speaker, it was the right thing to do.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's amazing with all the things that the minister says he's done in Cape Breton that the unemployment rate is still 16% and climbing. There must be something wrong with that logic, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in opposition, the NDP in opposition called the large corporate donations that they were going to corporate welfare bums in Nova Scotia. That's the words that came from the present Minister of Health. That's the words that came from the former Minister of Finance and now the member for Fairview. They railed against corporate give-outs when they were in opposition, and now they're cozy in the pockets of big business in Nova Scotia. How times have changed. Mr. Speaker, since October of 2009, shortly after this government took office, the number of unemployed workers in Cape Breton has jumped by 21%. This minister has been ignoring economic diversification and instead signing over hundreds of millions of dollars to corporations who end up laying off Nova Scotians and cutting wages and benefits. Because of this failed approach, we have the worst GDP growth, the second lowest wage growth, and Nova Scotians are losing full-time work and being forced to take on part-time jobs to try to keep up with the rising costs of electricity, heating oil, gas, and food. The NDP minister's record in Cape Breton is a 20% spike in unemployment since taking office, and he's going to have to answer for that. Mr. Speaker, why has this minister ignored the need to diversify the economy in Cape Breton and get people back to work?
Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can remember since we've been in government, I remember small companies as well as large companies. I've already talked about New Page. What about Bill did it, Mr. Speaker? What about Stream, Mr. Speaker? You know, there's TechLink now, Mr. Speaker, a company that we've invested heavily in to give them an opportunity to go out and make money. Mr. Speaker, we've made investments in Cape Breton. Unlike other governments, Mr. Speaker, of the past, we made good investments in Cape Breton. We believe in Cape Breton. We believe in the hard-working Cape Bretoners, and the recent investment in New Page is a testimony to that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton South and his final supplementary.
Last I heard, Mr. Speaker, New Page is only half the employment that they used to have in that particular industry because of this government. But I want to remind, Mr. Speaker, I want to remind Cape Bretoners that this minister keeps talking about his role in Stream. I'll tell you how little this minister knows about his own department. Stream was in Glace Bay long before this government ever came to office in Nova Scotia. And it was brought to Nova Scotia, it was brought to Cape Breton by a payroll rebate system that the previous Liberal government in this province set up in Cape Breton, in Glace Bay. So, Mr. Speaker, time after time, this minister talks about a success story in Stream. He had nothing to do with that, Mr. Speaker, and Nova Scotians should know that, as well as he's had nothing to do with some of the other supposed success stories that he's toting in this House. Mr. Speaker, in the last 3 years, Cape Breton has seen employment drop and unemployment rise. Young people are finding it harder and harder to live and work in their communities. Many of those who do find work end up finding it out west, and we all know and have relatives that are employed out west because of the lack of opportunities in Cape Breton. Young people need jobs to be able to choose to stay in their communities, but instead the minister has given away another 10 today, $600 million to 7 corporations now, who 6 of them in turn have laid off more than 1,300 workers and slashed wages and benefits. Mr. Speaker, $600 million in corporate handouts, and Cape Breton has still seen unemployment jump by over 20% in the last 3 years. Mr. Speaker, I think I've struck a chord with the Premier. He seems very animated over there listening to my comments. So, Mr. Speaker, what more proof does the minister need for him to realize that his multi-million-dollar handouts to large corporations aren't working for the people of Cape Breton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member commented about Stream, and I just want to read you something from Hansard. It's from another member from Cape Breton, and it goes like this, Mr. Speaker. That's it? Well, Mr. Speaker, the Stream $2.1 million was a payroll rebate. Well, it says rebates here, but I think he meant rebate, through NSBI with job targets. So, and this is coming from a member from Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker. So, I'm glad the minister took my advice on that file, Mr. Speaker, and I will table that. And I want to, you know, you can't have it every way, and I'll just, one other thing I want to add, one other thing I will add, Mr. Speaker, is I remember when that member over there was Minister of Economic and Rural Development, Mr. Speaker, and I'll tell you right now, the unemployment was less when we were in government than what it was under your watch.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The family of Raymond Tavel said this government failed to give adequate consideration to public safety in the report of commission in response to his death. And I quote, "It is unacceptable to reason that we should not pursue GPS tracking in Nova Scotia because it has yet to be adopted in any other forensic facility in Canada." Mr. Speaker, it does not matter whether or not people have been found criminally responsible. If they are dangerous, Nova Scotians deserve to be protected from them. Will the minister start using ankle bracelets with GPS tracking for people who are a danger to themselves and to others?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for that question. First, I want to acknowledge the loss to the Tavel family and the impact that the passing had. Putting that to one side, I want to point out the difference between this government's approach to the issue of bracelets and the third party. The third party believes in building jails and filling them. They believe that people that have a mental illness should be treated like criminals. And this government believes, and this minister believes, and this government believes that if somebody has a mental illness, they should be treated by the healthcare professionals.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Progressive Conservative Party believes people with mental illness deserve treatment as well. But we also believe that that needs to be balanced with protection for those people and for the people who are on the street with them. That's right. Now, Raymond Tavel's family is trying hard to have some good come from his tragic death. They believe providing patients who have a history of violence with ankle bracelets should be common sense. This government, instead, wishes to provide patients with cell phones. This is not common sense, Mr. Speaker. The Tavel family argues, and I quote, "There must be an appropriate and nuanced balance between the joint goals of public protection and reasonable treatment and rights of offenders who have been found not criminally responsible for what could otherwise be criminal conduct." So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, this government does need balance. Will the minister take immediate steps to assure there will be electronic monitoring ankle bracelets available for people who, though not found criminally responsible for their crime, nevertheless are a danger to themselves and to the public?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, on the issue of bracelets, and to place a bracelet on someone, it's best left to the court to make a decision if someone has that issue. On the issue of somebody in a forensic institution, that public safety is an issue, and it is always an issue. And for this minister who has spent a lifetime serving the public from a safety perspective, I believe in that firmly. But to try and hold a tragedy to a family and to a community, the Tavel, and trying to make the political hay that you're trying to make on the issue of bracelets, that's just totally inappropriate and offensive.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this minister has a problem. He has a report that contained no representation from experts in protecting the public, a report with no balance. The balance is exactly what the Tavel family wants. They want the public and the patients protected by considering electronic monitoring. Yet this government will go forward with any idea that gives them peace of mind. Appointing a bureaucrat to give patients a call to see where they are will not make a difference for those who are a risk to public safety. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question to the minister, if he won't provide more ankle bracelets immediately, will he stand here and tell the Tavel family that he will get a report that does give proper consideration to public safety?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you for that question. The recommendations that come out of the review are 18, and this government is taking steps, and this department is taking steps to accomplish all of those 18 recommendations. I want to assure the Tavel family, since the Conservatives are trying to use them and play them in a political sense, that we take their loss and the impact on their family seriously. I have trust and faith in the people that work in the forensic institution. I have trust and faith in our correctional officers that do their job, unlike the Conservative Party, who do not care or respect the staff that we have working that do a great job day in and day out.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of the Environment. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, just 2 years ago, this government, the NDP, lowered mercury emission standards for Nova Scotia Power. Now, that was among the first signs that Nova Scotians had that they had elected Nova Scotia Power rather than the NDP to government. At the time, At the time, the NDP said the reason behind the decision to lower emission targets, despite every other province meeting their targets and having lower power bills, they said it would save money. And Mr. Speaker, I will table the press release where the government said it would lower the bills. Mr. Speaker, does the minister still stand by the government statement that reducing mercury emission targets would help with power rates?
The Honourable Minister of Energy. The Honourable Minister of Environment, I'm sorry.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. Again, we have a Nova Scotia approach and something that we feel that we're going to meet these goals and actually surpass them. So we have a made in Nova Scotia approach. Unlike the opposition, we do things right. Thank you very much for the question.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that's a funny response because 2 years ago, this minister was standing up and saying that by reducing the mercury standards and by putting the health of Nova Scotians at risk, that Nova Scotia power bills would be lower. Yet the Liberty audit looked at that, and it turns out that as a result of lowering the mercury emission standards, Nova Scotia Power spent $3.65 million more on fuel than they would have otherwise with the original targets, and I will table that. That has been passed on to ratepayers. Mr. Speaker, will the minister now admit that decreasing the mercury emission requirements actually cost ratepayers?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Again, I want to thank the member opposite for the question and something that we have laid out. Our goals will be achieved, and we'll achieve them by reducing mercury. But I also want to point out our history as 3 short years as an environment, and something that the member opposite need to appreciate. I think we have a track record that can really be appreciated. In environment, we have been recognized in the 3 years as A- with drinking water standards. We also received 2 awards in Copenhagen in 2009. We're world leaders when it comes to house waste management, Mr. Speaker, and we have signed an equivalency agreement with the federal government, saving over $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, we know about the environment, we protect it. Welcome to paradise. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, apparently the minister has no way to answer this question. He did 2 years ago, and maybe he should spend some time down at the board hearing where it's one of the few things that even Nova Scotia Power isn't arguing with Liberty about the reason that this was caused. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, he can talk about the equivalency agreement, yet even the Premier couldn't put the numbers on and couldn't promise that can be met now because of the problems with Muskrat Falls and the delays on that, so we don't know what's going to happen there. Mr. Speaker, much of that equipment had already been installed, so we're still paying the amortization on the cost. Ratepayers are paying the amortization cost for the mercury equipment, and the Bag House in Trenton is an example where it was exceeding expectations on mercury capture. And Mr. Speaker, the fact is that $3.65 million extra was spent on fuel because they purchased lower quality fuel because they didn't feel they had to buy the better one. It burned less efficiently, and as a result, they had to burn more total coal, which cost ratepayers more. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister now apologize to Nova Scotians for this mistake, which cost ratepayers more than it needed to?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Well, thank you very much, and again, I welcome the question. Again, I want to point out that we have a made in Nova Scotia approach to address this issue. Unlike the opposition, they had many years to deal with this issue, and like the fossil fuel itself, they are fossil because they did not deal with the issue when they had the opportunity. Thank you for the question. We have a path forward. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, young Nova Scotians are facing higher debt, higher costs of their higher education, and fewer job prospects in the province of Nova Scotia. There is currently a tuition policy review underway, which could see tuitions increase as a direct result of the NDP deep cuts to universities. Students want to know where their Premier stands, Mr. Speaker, so will the Premier stand up for students and prevent further tuition increases in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to start by saying, and I know that the member for Yarmouth knows that not a single word of what he said was true, right? Mr. Speaker, in fact, this government brought in a debt cap that actually capped the amount of debt, and it was a great benefit to students by lowering the amount of debt that they have. That we have invested more in student aid than any government in this province, with the exception of the advent of the student aid program.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier might be in denial, but students and their families who are paying high tuition aren't. The question was about tuition. Mr. Speaker, yesterday students marched to protest the rising costs of a post-secondary education and the crushing debt load that they carry. A report released by Sun Life Financial concluded that economic uncertainty and financial strain is having a detrimental effect on mental health of young people. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This is a real problem which is only made worse by the dismal track record of this Premier when it comes to employment opportunities for young people. Young Nova Scotians faced with crushing debt loads and higher unemployment rates in this province are being forced to leave their communities to take jobs elsewhere, primarily out west. Mr. Speaker, why is this Premier giving Nova Scotia Power a free ride and doling out hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate handouts to companies who lay off Nova Scotians instead of investing in the future of our young people?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, so far, this government has invested some $90 million in student aid. Like I said, more than has been invested at any time in the future, reducing the amount of debt that students have in this province. In addition, we are investing in good jobs for young people, for new grads, and a perfect example happened today when a co-op student from engineering stood with me at the announcement of projects for 440 engineering jobs that will come to Nova Scotia that will attract exactly those kinds of students. And yet, the Liberals speak out against these kinds of investments, Mr. Speaker. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because they are job killers.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Please use that public. It's just ridiculous that the Premier would even say that. It doesn't even make any sense. Yeah. One of the parties in here are job killers. We all want to kill jobs. The fact is,
Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Very difficult to hear in the chair if I'm listening for the debate to find out if the debate is parliamentary in any way. It's very difficult to hear when everybody's chattering all the time. And I can't hear some things that are being said sitting in this chair. Now, I would ask that everybody realize that the honourable member from Yarmouth has the floor. So I'd ask for a little bit of quiet from here on in, please. The honourable member for Yarmouth on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier stands and boasts often about all the great opportunities he's creating for young Nova Scotians in this province. But under his leadership, Mr. Speaker, over 4,800 young people have left this province to look for work elsewhere. That's the record of this Premier, Mr. Speaker. Since the Premier took office, young people have lost full-time jobs at a rate of 18.3%. Over that same period, unemployment has spiked by over 50% for young women. It is these same young people who are saddled with tens of thousands of dollars in debt when they finish school. Quite clearly, corporations are now more important to this NDP Premier than the students he once courted while in opposition. So my question, and I'll table that data as well, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Premier is, Mr. Speaker, will he finally stand up for students and commit to this House today that he will not allow any more tuition increases in the province of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as they would know, under our government, the average tuition fees in this province are actually falling below the national average. Mr. Speaker, when we came into government, the first thing that happened was that the money that was set aside by the federal government for the purposes of reducing tuition came to an end. The trust fund that was in place came to an end. So the first thing that we had to do, if we did nothing, the tuitions in the province would have went up 15 to 20% because that money was no longer available. So the first thing that we did, Mr. Speaker, is we backfilled $30 million in order to ensure that tuitions did not rise 15 to 30%. And here's the ironic thing. In order to do that, Mr. Speaker, we had to bring in a budget which the Liberals voted against.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are finding it harder to pay their bills, their power bills, and they feel let down by a premier who continues to stand up for Nova Scotia Power's shareholders instead of standing up for our province's most vulnerable citizens. The premier could have stood up against a power rate increase, but he didn't. The premier could legislate that shareholders pay for efficiency programs, but he won't. And the premier could take action to make power bills lower for low-income Nova Scotians, but he refuses. People are wondering what happened to the NDP principles. Will the premier stand up for low Nova Scotians today? Will the premier stand up today for low-income Nova Scotians and make Nova Scotia Power pay for its efficiency programs instead of making it yet another NDP burden on Nova Scotians living in poverty?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one of the very first things that this government did was put in place the removal of the HST from energy. Mr. Speaker, we took the HST off of children's clothing. Mr. Speaker, we put in place the affordability tax credit to actually put more money in the pockets of those people who are most affected by economic uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, no one has done more to ensure that those who are the most vulnerable in this province are properly taken care of than this government.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but that's certainly not what we heard at the Community Services Committee the other day from the face of poverty. In fact, I believe the word was negligible. Insignificant. This premier is handing out big checks to corporations and promising them breaks on power rates. How is it that the premier had no issues giving Stern a break on their power but does nothing to give low-income Nova Scotians a break on their power bills?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we took the tax off of home energy, something the Liberals voted against. Mr. Speaker, this year we will spend $70 million on the affordability tax credit. We will spend another $25 million on the children's tax credit. Mr. Speaker, all of this money goes right into the pockets of low-income families. The last time the Liberals were in power, they clawed back that money from poor families, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, they are proposing to put in place a scheme of deregulation that will increase power rates for those same people by 30 to 50%.
The honourable member for... The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal caucus, as the Premier well knows, has stated repeatedly that we will not put the provincial portion of the HST back on power bills, and we will demand that it's the shareholders of Nova Scotia Power who will pay for efficiency programs instead of Nova Scotian families.
Order. I can't hear the debate. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Philip Barkhouse of Chester Basin contacted Efficiency Nova Scotia to participate in its low-income homeowner service. Instead of service, Mr. Barkhouse got a letter saying he's on the wait list due to the program's limited budget, and I will table that letter. In fact, Mr. Barkhouse was told he should expect a call from Clean Nova Scotia in 2013. So this NDP government continues to impose what is, in essence, a flat tax on Nova Scotians, including our poorest citizens. These are the very families who cannot even access these programs that they're forced to pay for. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this: why did this Premier and his NDP government continue to make low-income Nova Scotians pay for efficiency programs they can't even access?
Honourable the Premier.
Now, let me see, 2013, so that's in 6 weeks. Mr. Speaker, I mean, really, and they're laughing about that. I mean, Mr. Speaker, the demand-side management charge was put in place after the board had hearings and heard from a whole collection of group across the province who said what they wanted.
The Honourable Premier has the floor, please.
Mr. Speaker, the consumer groups, ecology groups right across the province said what they wanted was an independent efficiency organization that would be free of government, Mr. Speaker, paid for so that they could deliver services that would benefit the entire population of Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, $42 million is what they collected. Ratepayers, as a result of this, saved $100 million. Mr. Speaker, $100 million. In fact, the savings are actually greater from the poorer Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, because it makes up a bigger part of their bill, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what they have said, and this is what the Liberal Party have said, they keep trying to weasel around it, but the reality is that okay? That's dodgy. Okay, I'll withdraw.
No, that is
I'll withdraw weasel, Mr. Speaker. What they try to do is maneuver around what they've said. The Leader of the Opposition voted against the HST coming off of home electricity. Then he voted in favor of the Conservatives putting it back on him. He campaigned against it twice in the leadership debate, Mr. Speaker, and he would remember, I certainly do, he said taking the HST off was bad public policy, Mr. Speaker. Did he believe it or doesn't he?
I would remind honourable members.
Take it outside. You'll get to the front bench someday, Clary. Maybe not so someday.
I'd like to remind the Honourable Premier that the word weasel was unparliamentary and retracting that. Thank you. And I'd also like to now recognize the Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to the most recent hunger count report, food bank usage is up 39.3% in Nova Scotia since 2008, and I'm tabling that. As well, food banks are seeing a marked increase in users who are employed. This should be no surprise, as our province is witnessing a displacement from full-time work to part-time jobs. At the same time, the Premier has handed out over $500 million, I guess $600 million now, to corporations that have laid off workers, cut wages, and slashed benefits. Meanwhile, more Nova Scotians have had to rely on part-time jobs and food banks. So my question, why are large corporations more important to the Premier than poor people?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, And I think it's sad that these kinds of questions get asked, really. Mr. Speaker, the reality is they vote against and they criticize the actual efforts that keep people working, Mr. Speaker. The investments in Port Hawkesbury mean that there are 1,000 people working. If they had their way, Mr. Speaker, they would have not supported Port Hawkesbury, and 1,000 or 1,400 people would be out of jobs, Mr. Speaker. That's because what they are doing is engaging either disingenuously in just political posturing. But you know something? I don't think so. I think the truth is the Liberals are simply job killers.
The honourable member. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, low income is the key factor in determining the need for food banks. Families are facing rent increases related to food. They're facing rising costs related to food, housing, and energy. There are currently over 1,800 families waiting for public housing in this province. Mr. Speaker, this doesn't even include the number of homeless people, nor does it reflect the number of poor families and seniors living in inadequate shelters or who have to choose between heating their homes or feeding their families. Nova Scotia needs a plan for affordable housing and not just Band-Aid programs and more talk. My question to the Premier, when will this government act to eliminate poverty and make a real investment in affordable housing?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For years, we watched while the Liberals continued to claw back income from the poorest Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That is just a reality. This is the same group of people who vote against increases in the minimum wage. They vote against taking the HST off of children's clothing. They vote against taking the HST off of children's shoes. They vote against taking the HST off of necessities like home electricity, Mr. Speaker. They want to see what is wrong with the program in Nova Scotia. They only have to look back to when they were in government, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is we are still suffering from Liberal governments both in this province and federally.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I find it interesting that the Premier should mention a clawback. I recently had a case where a woman couldn't access the emergency home repair program because her child tax credit pushed her over the limit. So there's enough blame to go around there. Mr. Speaker, food banks are seeing an increase in numbers, soup kitchens are seeing an increase in need, and more children are relying on school breakfast programs. More and more people are in need and they're looking to their government to help. While this government announced the special medical needs would no longer be covered for our poorest citizens, this Premier was negotiating $500 million deals with corporations. While this government was negotiating deals on power rates for big corporations, families were having their power cut off because they can't pay their bills. How does the Premier have an endless supply of cash to dole out to corporations while more and more Nova Scotians are faced with the question, heat or eat?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the simple fact of the matter is that we are investing in good jobs in the province, so the very people that she's talking about actually have the best form of support, which is a decent job. Mr. Speaker. But I would just remind the member from Bedford Birch Cove that she should think back to the mid-90s when the federal Liberals were gutting things like the child benefits. They were ending universality for allowances, Mr. Speaker, and canceling the grants to universities, Mr. Speaker. You know, she might remember, she might actually know somebody who was part of that government.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism. The NDP mismanagement of the economy has taken the worst toll on the people of the Southern Shore. South Shore has lost 7,500 full-time jobs. That means 7,500 people who are worried about their future in rural Nova Scotia. So last week, the minister said, and I quote, "This government has protected jobs in the province of Nova Scotia." So why didn't the people and jobs of the South Shore benefit from this minister's protection?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's on Monday. Next week, I think there's a grand opening at White Point. I think it's Monday. Somebody might want to, Mr. Speaker. So that's an investment by this government in the South Shore, Mr. Speaker. So we. Enjoying the South Shore, Mr. Speaker, we've been working collaboratively with the people of the South Shore region, and White Point is only one example. Earlier today, Mr. Speaker, I tabled a report that was in the Herald today, Mr. Speaker, talking about the South Shore and talking about all the good things and the positive attitude that was going on in the South Shore, and certainly highlighted by the collaboration with this government.
The Honourable Member for Argyle on his first supplementary.
The people of the South Shore suffered another blow yesterday when Twin Cities Air Service announced that it would be ending the Yarmouth to Portland flights. This announcement means yet another transportation link from Yarmouth area has been severed and likely will lead to more job losses, Mr. Speaker. The unemployment rate has risen to 13.1%. This rate of unemployment is closer to the near bankrupt countries of Greece and Spain than it is to the Canadian average. So my question to the minister, will the minister finally admit that the NDP management of the economy has failed people of southern Nova Scotia and is making life harder for the entire region?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know many people, myself included, would like to see a successful air service in Southwest in Yarmouth. I think if there was a successful air service in Yarmouth, that would be a clear indication of things have turned around. Mr. Speaker, unlike previous governments, under the Jobs Here strategy, Mr. Speaker, we are planning for the future. What we don't want to do, and like past governments, is we don't want to do things on a daily basis. We want to make sure that we make sound investments to promote not only Southwest Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, but the entire province. And again, I reiterate is that things are going reasonably well in Southwest Nova Scotia, and I tabled the Herald report, and I would encourage the honourable member to look at that Herald report.
The Honourable Member for Argyle on his final supplementary.
Is that the standard has changed, that doing reasonably well now means an unemployment rate of 13.1%. Mr. Speaker, the numbers speak for themselves. South Shore workforce decreased by 3,800 people. That means 3,800 people have given up on finding a job. Population in the area has decreased by 2,700 people. That means 2,700 people have given up on the area and moved somewhere else. So my question to the minister, in an NDP Nova Scotia, the government picks winners and losers. So why does this minister continue to punish the people of Southwest Nova Scotia and offer them no relief?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I know that one thing, Mr. Speaker, is that there are many people that live in the Southwest region.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the article that I tabled today, one of the things that's said in the article by a very well-known individual in the Southwest region that has been very, very involved is what was said is that we are better off today than what we were 3 years ago, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Annapolis Collaborative Health Centre will officially open on Friday. I must note for the record that it has already experienced its first closure, Mr. Speaker, daytime closure due to the lack of nurses. Overnight, the facility will be staffed by 1 RN and primary care paramedic, which essentially means primary health care 24/7, not necessarily emergency care, is being offered through what used to be an emergency department, Mr. Speaker. When a patient arrives and requires emergency care beyond the capacity of the collaborative team, emergency care needs to be provided. So my question to the Minister, could the Minister of Health please tell the residents of Annapolis what he is doing to ensure there's adequate emergency care should a patient arrive at the Annapolis Collaborative Health Centre requiring it?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the leader for that question. No question, we're very glad to see another collaborative emergency centre open in Nova Scotia to provide care for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure the member from Annapolis and the members or the residents who live in that area that will be served by the Collaborative Emergency Centre that emergency care will be delivered to those residents. The last time I checked, Mr. Speaker, paramedics provide emergency care.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Annapolis Community Health Centre could take level 1 and 2 emergency patients, Mr. Speaker. The new Collaborative Emergency Centre cannot. We have heard from the health professionals in the area, Mr. Speaker, that no ambulance coverage in the Bridgetown area about 40% of the time, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, they can only provide care if they're there, Mr. Speaker. The ability of the patients to access emergency care 24/7 is non-existent for the residents being served by the new collaborative emergency team, which ironically, Mr. Speaker, was developed to keep emergency rooms open 24/7. So my question to the Minister, how can the emergency care be relied upon at the Annapolis Collaborative Centre when 40% of the time Bridgetown has no ambulance coverage, which results in a domino effect in all emergency vehicles in the area?
Honourable the Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No question, we have one of the most state-of-the-art ambulance service, ground and air ambulance service in North America, Mr. Speaker. And it's well recognized that we have a system that can react to calls throughout the province, Mr. Speaker. We have a system status plan that oversees the ambulance services in Nova Scotia. So when there is a number of calls in certain regions, those ambulances in other regions start moving around the province, Mr. Speaker. It's a great system that ensures that the closest ambulance responds to the emergency closest to them, Mr. Speaker. It's a long way from where we were a number of years ago. Collaborative emergency centres, Mr. Speaker, are the key to ensuring that not only nurses, but paramedics and physicians work to their full scope of practice, Mr. Speaker. And I have full confidence that collaborative emergency centres will meet the needs of Nova Scotians and the emergency needs of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, I want to thank the Minister for congratulating the former Liberal government on its foresight to be able to create the emergency services that we have in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, what's happening, Mr. Speaker, under the present situation, closing to community health collaborative care centres, Mr. Speaker, without those facility emergency rooms being open, we rely on the ambulance service and the ambulance bases being, Mr. Speaker, having ambulances there. And the Minister knows it's a domino effect, that when something happens, the rigs move continually up the valley. All the citizens of the Annapolis area are asking, has the Minister taken this into account when he's now closing the emergency room and telling them to call 911? Where's the ambulance going to be? Has he taken that into account to make sure that we have the proper care when we need it?
Honourable the Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would agree. The only good decision from the former Liberal government was from Dr. Ron Stewart, Mr. Speaker, and it dealt with paramedics in this province. I can tell you on a number of occasions, and being a healthcare provider in the 90s, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a good time for healthcare providers under a former Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. We're going to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we have a system in place that meets the needs of Nova Scotians. And collaborative emergency centres will do that, Mr. Speaker. Those nurses, those paramedics that are working in the collaborative emergency centres are in contact with medical control oversight, Mr. Speaker, so they have access to a medical doctor, so that they can work as a team, Mr. Speaker. The problem in the past is that we continue to do things the same old way, Mr. Speaker, and they weren't meeting the needs of Nova Scotians. That's why we have to change the model of care, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're ensuring that nurses, paramedics, physicians, Mr. Speaker, work to their full scope of practice and that they work in a collaborative approach to address the issues, Mr. Speaker. And I know that the residents in the communities that are served by collaborative emergency centres currently, Mr. Speaker, they appreciate it and they welcome that, Mr. Speaker. Even the leader of the Liberal.
Please. The time allotted for questions. The honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism should get an Academy Award for fiction in this place. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education and Tourism during question period stated that his government put the call center stream operation in Glace Bay, which is at best a misleading statement. The facts are, in this case, Mr. Speaker, that stream has been in Glace Bay for close to 15 years, brought there with a payroll rebate system set up by the Liberal government in the late 90s. So I would ask the Minister of Economic Development and Tourism whether he should set this House straight and apologize to the House for misleading the House on the fact that he did not create these jobs in Cape Breton. And I see as soon as I started my remarks, he left the House, so he's not going to respond to
Order, order, please. Order, please. Order, please. It is unparliamentary that whether a member is in the House or outside of the House. But again, this is not a point of order. This is a This is not a point of order. It is a disagreement over facts between two members. The honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, in my capacity as House Leader for the official opposition, I'd ask that you now call opposition business Bill number 95, the Reliability and Accountability in Electricity Act.
Opposition members' business. We will now call Bill number 95, the Reliability and Accountability in Electricity Act. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased today to rise in my place and speak to Bill number 95. And the official House Leader has read out the bill, Bill number 95, and it's to deal with reliability, responsiveness, and accountability, distribution of electricity in our province. I think it's first of all, I think it's important to provide a background and a backdrop as to why this bill is necessary and why it's coming forth. And it has a great deal of detail that I think, those who are following the debate during the official opposition day, I think perhaps we can put some of this into context for them because it does outline very, very well as to why it's necessary and steps that can be taken to improve reliability. So I want in this current context to talk first of all about the scenario that exists in our province. We have had a 25% rate increase in the electrical rates here in Nova Scotia. And when you're paying the second highest rates in the country, it's important that we have a top-notch system. So therefore, reliability and responsiveness are part of what Nova Scotians would expect from Nova Scotia Power, their service provider, a monopoly service provider, and therefore I think when we're at that kind of a current rate of electricity, then the expectations are very, very high. We also have a company that also has among the management team some of the highest salaries, if not the highest salaries in the country. And when we look at a company like Quebec Hydro, which has over 10 million customers in Quebec alone, and providing power all the way along the eastern seaboard into New York State, you know, we wonder why what really is a little utility. Nova Scotia Power, by the measure of Canada, when we take a look at Quebec Hydro, Ontario Hydro, BC Hydro, we know that Nova Scotia Power is indeed a very, very small entity, but yet, you know, we should have the most efficient and, in fact, a better rate for Nova Scotia customers than what we currently have. We also have a bonus scheme that's extremely generous, and I know when the last bonuses were announced, in fact, Nova Scotians were outraged, but they were actually even more outraged by the fact that the Premier, you know, who promised a better deal for families, in fact, defended Nova Scotia Power. That was perhaps even more surprising and more of an outrage than the actual bonuses that the Nova Scotia Power management team actually received. And we also, again, just to reiterate, a company that guarantees a rate of return, and rate of return perhaps you know, is higher on the agenda than reliability and responsiveness, because we know that Nova Scotia Power guarantees a rate of return somewhere from 9.1 to 9.5. We know that for the past 10 years, $100 million from Nova Scotia Power rates, the rate collected here in the province from over 400,000 customers, goes off to Emera. And we're seeing a great deal actually invested, in fact, most of it outside of Nova Scotia. And so this is why over the past 10 years, with $1 billion collected through Nova Scotia Power, going to Emera for investments elsewhere, you know, there comes a time when we need to have legislation that does put some guarantee, put some teeth in terms of what would be a good standard of reliability and responsiveness and accountability of the distribution of electricity in the province. So I did want to draw attention to the bill in some of its detail, because one of the requirements would be the minister shall set performance standards respecting the corporation's electricity service reliability, electricity service disruption preparedness, and electricity service restoration, and communications to the public relating to electricity service disruption. Now, we know, living in Nova Scotia, we have a very challenging climate. We know that there's going to be power interruptions. And, you know, we all hope that we get through fall with the heavy foliage on the trees, and certainly we have a lot of tree-lined streets in our communities, and we know they can be the culprit with bringing down power lines. So we always are hoping to get by that season. So, you know, we will have perhaps another, you know, white wand or Hurricane Juan, those events will take place. And they are exceptional events, and I think most of us are understanding during those times when they do occur. And we know that we have outstanding linemen in the province and Nova Scotia employees, Nova Scotia Power employees who work their utmost to restore power. However, there are occasions when you know, the reliability factor gets questioned, especially when old power lines that have been in service for a lot of years seem to have, do have multiple outages. We had before us recently from in one of the committees, we had a fish processing plant that had a severe outage, that had an outage in July, and they lost tens of thousands of dollars of product because, again, the line was not kept up to the standard that should be there to guarantee no interruption of service. So we also need to talk about electricity service disruption preparedness. Now, we know that one of the areas, and we keep hearing in this House many times when we talk about Nova Scotia Power and as the service provider, and the fact of, is it investing enough money in vegetation control along the power lines? And that's always a question that again, perhaps some degree of expertise, some degree of monitoring, Madam Speaker, that perhaps we're not always given, a full analysis of the system. But again, from what people have to tell us, their stories, I think, do count for something in this area. And we know that year in, year out, there perhaps is not enough vegetation control along the system. And even when the foliage is off, we know that tree branches are one of the major causes when we have, wind storms. And in fact, what will tomorrow morning bring? We're probably going to get winds of 50, 60, 70 kilometers an hour tonight. The potential is there for a power outage. So we asked the question during this summer season, did Nova Scotia Power invest enough in terms of preparedness for service disruption? So this brings also to service restoration, and this is the area, whether it's in your home and you're counting on getting the electricity back in a certain number of hours so that there is no spoilage of food, or the heat is on. Some of the basic necessities, in fact, are looked after. And again, people do call their MLA when the power seems to be out for too long a period of time. We know we get those calls. One of the areas that I've often thought about in terms of Nova Scotia Power, to again show itself as a good corporate citizen, would be to support our fire departments who, during times of storms, when power lines go down, they go out to assist them and be vigilant so that, when there are live wires, the electricity is on until the power company arrives, that they become the guardian, if you wish. And it's an area that I've often thought that perhaps when it comes to being a good corporate citizen, that making some kind of a a donation to those volunteer fire departments may be one of the areas, in fact, that they could acknowledge again the support that our volunteer fire departments often give. But service restoration, again, the identification, the communications, I think has improved. If there's anything, again, on the positive side that came out of Hurricane Juan and White Juan was to do an overview of the system. So in terms of reliability, one of the requirements that this bill asks for would be the corporation shall file with the board no later than March 1st of each year a service reliability plan for review and approval by the board. Service reliability plan filed pursuant must include information respecting the provision of a reliable and safe electricity system, the adequacy of anticipated time frames for restoring electricity service in the event of a service outage. And the board, upon a hearing, due to the corporation's failure to implement in service reliability plan, in fact, there would indeed be penalties appropriate to not providing that reliability to Nova Scotia customers. And with that, I conclude my remarks, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I welcome this opportunity to speak on Bill 95. And really, I rise in my place here today to debate an important issue for all Nova Scotians and to ensure that we have greater reliability and responsiveness and accountability and the distribution of electricity here in Nova Scotia, here within our province. And Madam Speaker, this government has a plan to address these same issues, a plan that has demonstrated, I believe, real progress. Our plan is focused on making sure that Nova Scotia does not repeat the mistakes of the past, does not repeat the mistakes of past governments in relying too long on a single source of energy. Instead, our government is focused on protecting the interests of future generations while protecting our environment, and it is also focused on helping Nova Scotians in the short term as we move to more stable, more diverse, to a cleaner electricity system here in this province. So I believe, Madam Speaker, we're truly standing up for Nova Scotians to ensure that they have the lowest and the fairest rates over both the short term and the long term. And to do this, we must change the way we power our province. The status quo can no longer remain. It's no longer acceptable. Actually, the cost of coal has increased by 75% in the past 7 years, and that truly is hurting Nova Scotians. And then truly that's the real reason why power rates have continued to go up. And Madam Speaker, I have a chart I want to table that shows that coal has gone up 75% in 6 years, from 2004 to 2011, and I'd like to table that if I could. For too long, previous governments ignored this issue and clung to an electrical system from the past. And I believe that we need to take action. We need to take that action now to address this. And that's why we're developing more local, more renewable sources of energy to get us off of expensive imported coal. And it's why our government has rolled back the Conservative tax energy and are saving Nova Scotians now 10% on their power bill by cutting the provincial portion of the HST from electricity. That's something the official opposition leader called bad public policy in a debate back in 2009. And I fully disagree with that. It's good policy to help relieve the cost of the Nova Scotians on their electricity rates. So, Madam Speaker, we know that removing the HST from home heating has saved the average Nova Scotian family more than $700 on their electricity bill. In fact, I think the exact figure is around $719. But unfortunately, the Liberals have a plan. They want to put the HST back on home heating, and that would ensure that rates increase considerably. Not only that, they want to deregulate electricity in this province, and that would from previous experience in other provinces, put rates up by more than 30 to 50% through their deregulation scheme. Madam Speaker, our government is also proposing several legislative amendments that will result in the permanent removal of Nova Scotia Power's executive bonuses. I had the opportunity to attend the UARB hearing in September and first announced that. Our Premier had pushed for that last year, but now we're going to make it permanent, and it's not fair that ordinary Nova Scotians have to pay for executive incentives or executive bonuses. That was a practice that was started, incidentally, by the Liberal government and was carried on by successful Conservative governments. It took an NDP government to finally take action, to finally stand up for Nova Scotia families. Our proposed changes will also cap salaries that are charged to ratepayers. It will limit the number of costly rate hearings, and it will ensure that board-ordered savings reviews are held by Nova Scotia Power in years when there's not a rate hearing. So, Madam Speaker, I'm going to ask you what have the Liberals done here? Well, the Liberals have introduced a bill here today that would force Nova Scotia Power to set performance standards around reliability and would impose significant fines on Nova Scotia Power when they aren't met. The fact is, Madam Speaker, that that's already in place. It's already there to protect Nova Scotians. The UARB already mandates Nova Scotia Power to maintain a reliable and high-performing electricity system. And I'm really surprised the opposition party perhaps isn't aware of that. Madam Speaker, a reliable electricity system is important in our daily lives and in our economy, and regulators have set standards for reliability for all utilities across North America. And Nova Scotia Power is obligated. Yes, they're obligated to meet all of those mandatory North American industry, operational, and planning standards. It is already subject to an independent third-party audit by the regulatory authorities, including the Utility and Review Board here in this province. It must meet rigorous industry standards as set out by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and also the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. Nova Scotia Power is also required to remain in good standing with the Maritime Reliability Coordinator. Of course, that's the New Brunswick system operator. Third-party audits are carried out by each of these organizations to ensure compliance, and Nova Scotia Power has been found to be consistently compliant through those audits. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, the UARB can also conduct independent audits and benchmarking on Nova Scotia's power electricity service reliability. And the UARB can initiate, and have done so in the past, third-party audits and Nova Scotia Power's electricity service reliability benchmarking of both their system and their performance. So, Madam Speaker, the opposition is also touting deregulation. I've heard mentioned that a lot here in the last number of days as a way to reduce electricity prices. But Nova Scotia families cannot afford deregulation. It has failed in provinces like Alberta. It has failed in provinces like Ontario. It's been tried in New Brunswick. It's been tried in California. It hasn't worked there. It's been tried in Maryland. It hasn't worked there either. And all it's done is cause huge rate spikes in those provinces and states. Madam Speaker, I'm going to table a report from RBC Dominion Securities that speaks about Alberta's failed attempt to deregulate. And it states this: in unnerving similarity to California's experience, this process has resulted in Alberta's power prices increasing from among the lowest in the world to among the highest in North America. We don't need that in Nova Scotia. The report goes on to say that wholesale electricity prices increased by more than 650% in just 4 years. 650%. We don't need that in Nova Scotia. So I'll table that for the House. Is that a road that Nova Scotia wants to go down? Well, I think not, Madam Speaker. Nova Scotia Power is obligated by law to serve all Nova Scotian loads at the lowest possible price while meeting its system reliability and environmental obligations. The Utilities and Review Board, an independent body, will ensure that that happens. And in point of fact, parts of Nova Scotia Power purchases large amounts of renewable energy from independent power producers. Madam Speaker, I want to remind the opposition of how we got to where we are today. Nova Scotia has a history of using imported coal as the main source of fuel to generate electricity. We all know that coal is dirty, it's a polluting fuel, it's a very expensive fuel, and Madam Speaker, we understand that the path to the future is through renewable, local and regional sources of clean energy. We're blessed in Nova Scotia with many clean energy sources right here in our province. In 2010, our government released its renewable electricity plan to promote and develop both large and small-scale renewable electricity projects. But, you know, we didn't stop there, Madam Speaker. We also put into place our renewable targets that would see a goal of 25% of our electricity from renewable sources by the year 2015 and 40% by 2020. We've also placed hard caps on greenhouse gas emissions in our electricity to help meet both environmental and energy objectives. And Madam Speaker, our goal is working. We're also bringing in measures to help Nova Scotians save energy on their own homes while adding green jobs to our economy. It's really a win-win all the way around. Because, Madam Speaker, through Efficiency Nova Scotia, Nova Scotians have saved across the province more than $200 million in energy saving, more than $200 million. So it boggles the mind why the Leader of the Opposition would state that he wants to cut this important program. Nova Scotians all over this province are benefiting from the efficiency program. I want to give one example of a lady, her name is Lou LeBlanc. She's a senior that lives in Wellington, and she has saved $780 a year in energy savings while participating in the Efficiency Nova Scotia program. She's a senior living on a fixed income, and despite what the Liberal opposition says that they're going to cut this program, I believe, and our government believes, that these programs are vital to Nova Scotians like Ms. LeBlanc in one of the thousands of low Nova Scotian households that have been helped by this efficiency program. I will table her story, if I could, Madam Speaker, so the Liberals perhaps can see that this is having an impact on low-income Nova Scotians, a program that they want to cancel for some reason, and it's really a benefit to many Nova Scotians. As I've mentioned, Madam Speaker, our electricity plan takes us out to the year 2020, and we are very confident that we're on track to meet both the renewable targets and the greenhouse gas emissions that we have in place. And it's certainly a good thing that we are on track, because the federal government now has put in some coal regulations and set emission targets for 2030 that would have us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by a further 3 megatons from the 2020 target out to the year 2030. And this means that Nova Scotia must tap into more sustainable sources of energy in order to meet that target. If not, the federal government will have us do it anyway, and they'll do it their way. And I know that would carry a substantial price tag, somewhere in the area of about $1.3 billion. So we have an equivalency agreement that will allow us to find another way to meet those same greenhouse gas targets, but not have to pay that excessive amount, because that's what it would cost to close down those coal generation plants right away. So it's a way of saving money, but still meeting our environmental targets. Getting off coal is no longer simply the choice. It is now a federal requirement that we have to meet. And that is where hydroelectricity from the Lower Churchill comes in. The Lower Churchill project will ensure the lowest and fairest rates over the long term. It will provide Nova Scotia with access to renewable power at a fixed rate for 35 years. The rate, once it's set, will stay at the same level for that length of time. The Lower Churchill project will also put us in an energy loop, so that we're no longer at the end of the extension cord. Instead, we'll have an opportunity to bring in power from both directions at market rates. And certainly that will mean that we'll have more choices. We'll be able to take power from multiple directions, from east or west or wherever the best buy may be. So, Madam Speaker, the hydroelectricity from the Lower Churchill will also be a reliable energy source to back up our increasing use of intermittent energy sources such as wind and tidal. So, of course, Madam Speaker, I think this project will create many good jobs in Nova Scotia, as certainly it will also in Newfoundland and Labrador, where there'll be opportunities there for Nova Scotians also to be working. But it's a win-win project, and it'll be up to about 10% of our power needs, as well as giving us the opportunity to buy at market rates over and above that. So I think it's a wonderful example of a regional cooperation that will benefit not only Nova Scotia, but certainly Newfoundland and Labrador, as I mentioned, but also our neighboring provinces of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. And so it's part of the Atlantic Energy Gateway initiative that will provide cooperation. So, Madam Speaker, we know that the impact of the costs of imported coal on our electricity bills right across this province, and we are doing something about it. We're not following in the path of the Liberal and Conservative governments that have gone on before us. We are taking action. And, Madam Speaker, we are standing up for Nova Scotians to ensure that they get the lowest and the fairest electricity rates that are possible. And while we pursue this lowest cost option for stabilizing rates over the longer term. So, Madam Speaker, I want to thank you for the opportunity here tonight to give our information and opinion on Bill 95, and just finally that we have a plan and we are going to stand by it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, thank you. I'm pleased to have a few minutes today to speak to Bill number 95, and it was interesting while listening to the minister talk about getting off of coal and other resources. He talks like that's going to happen tomorrow, Madam Speaker, and he's not thinking, you know, I don't know if he wants to instill in Nova Scotians that we're just going to shut her down tomorrow or whatever day that might come to fruition, that we see something else, which he might refer to as the Newfoundland deal or Muskrat Falls, which may never come to fruition, as we know. We see the costs continually rising. We've seen a huge jump of nearly 20%, taking us to well over $7 billion, and that was just on the capital piece in Newfoundland. What does that mean for the link itself? What we do know, Madam Speaker, for the link itself is that Nova Scotian ratepayers are going to be on the hook for 20% of the cost of that. Well, we don't even know what that 20% equates to. We've asked the Premier. He says, I don't know. We've asked the Minister. I don't even know if he said I don't know. He's not even answered the question, I don't think. So it's interesting to hear him talk about, you know, we're going to get off of fossil fuels. And yes, we need to get off fossil fuels. I don't think that anybody in this House has ever disagreed with him on that. I think that we know we're going there. I think that clean energy is the way to go. But we can't do that tomorrow, and we can't do it without doing it the right way. It costs money. We know that too. Ratepayers know it all too well. We're paying high rates based on the plan that we have today, and that is a plan that is just not working. And Nova Scotians are saying we need a break on our power rates. Nova Scotians are not saying we need a deal for 35 years with a price that, oh, by the way, we don't know what the price is. They need to know what the price is. We need a lot more information before the deal with Newfoundland is ever complete. And one of the things that is obviously concerning Madam Speaker, is that we're not looking at other opportunities. Now, I just heard him talking about Newfoundland, or I heard him talking about New Brunswick and other provinces and a regional plan, and maybe he's listening to what the Progressive Conservatives have been talking about by way of creating a regional energy market. That is, of course, one of our pieces, rewriting the deal that they've put into place that is not affordable, you know, and guaranteeing Nova Scotia Power's profit. That's all done. We're going to remove that. We do that today. We wouldn't be waiting and allowing another increase to come on the backs of Nova Scotia ratepayers in 13 and in 14, which this government is willing to stand by, Madam Speaker, and just let happen and do nothing about it. If they really wanted to do something about it, and they really wanted to do something more than like make a future election pitch, and that's what this is all about, Madam Speaker. Oh, we'll freeze the rates after, or you can't do this, or you can't do that, but not until 2015. That's not going to work. People aren't buying into that. They need help today. And I'm sure, Madam Speaker, that you have people coming into your offices. I know that every member probably does, talking about their power bills and struggling to pay them. We all have families that are not well off in our areas, who are single mums and dads and raising their families and working, and actually people that are working families with 2 people working and are struggling to get by. And they're finding that they just can't meet the needs of paying that high power bill. They're worrying about what's going to happen in January of 2013. They're certainly worrying about where that's going to happen and what that's going to be in 2014 as well. And everything else that goes on with the highest costs. You know, taxes are up. Other things are up. They see no breaks, Madam Speaker, no breaks whatsoever. You know, we count on the URB to step in here and to review something. All they're reviewing is one project. Where are the other opportunities? What are the other alternatives for Nova Scotia ratepayers? Why isn't the government seeking out many options? Why are they focused solely on a plan that they don't know what is going to cost and one that we don't have any guarantee that will ever happen? If they talk about getting off of fossil fuels, they talk about cleaner energies, and more importantly, they talk about, and we all stand here and talk about, long-term sustainable energy opportunities and best rates for Nova Scotians now and well into the future. There's no plan that we can see that guarantees that that's going to take place with where we're heading right now with the Muskrat Falls deal. It doesn't say that. All it says is we're going into a long-term deal. It doesn't say anything about being affordable, Madam Speaker, at all. It doesn't talk about that. And how could it? How could it possibly talk about that when asked and we don't know what the price is? Now, we've talked about this a lot. We're probably going to talk about it a lot more in this session and in future sessions in this House until we can get it right. People want us to get it right. We just cannot continue to go the way we're going. Nova Scotians need a break on their energy. You want us to go on and you want us to move on. Government says we need to move to clean energy. We need to do it in a hurry, as far as a lot of people are concerned. People are in agreement that they want to move to green energy sources. They want to see affordable green energy sources, not necessarily just the hydro deal that exists. But you know, right now, as I started this off a few minutes ago talking about the minister talked about getting off fossil fuels and making it sound like that was going to happen right away, Madam Speaker. We know that we're going to be on coal for some years to come. We know that there are dates whereby things will be decommissioned in this province. The plants will come offline in Trenton and other places, and in Cape Breton and wherever else. There'll be dates, and I know that they're all listed, and I don't have them in front of me, so I can't quote them exactly, but I've seen them many times, and we all know that that's going to take place. We know that we're going to burn coal in this province for many years to come yet. This project hasn't even begun, and we're burning coal today. And we know that the price of coal has dropped. I know that government will stand over there and the minister and talk about how the price of coal is expensive, but we know that the price of coal has been high in the past, but it is actually down considerably right now, somewhere around $58 a ton, I believe. You know, why aren't we looking at our own resources, our other natural resources, and saying what exists here in the province of Nova Scotia? What opportunities are there? What about the regional market? What about New Brunswick and Quebec and Maine or whomever else there might be to buy from? The plan that we should be looking at is every opportunity that exists for Nova Scotia ratepayers to have and to be able to purchase the very best deal that exists. And this deal that the NDP have put forward is not it. The Liberal bill, Reliability and Accountability in the Electricity Act, Bill number 95, Madam Speaker, it doesn't address that either. We're talking about rewarding the power company to some degree, but what it does is it rewards the government for failings of the power company. If we're going to reward anybody, we should be thinking about rewarding the ratepayers. If there's money that comes back, and we've already seen what the power company will do, and we know there's money owed back. There's $22 million right now outstanding, and we'll soon find out whether that's going to come back. Madam Speaker, we know that that's going to come back. It doesn't do anything to guarantee money back in the ratepayers' pockets. We need to ensure that rates are stabilized. It'd be great if we could all stand here and say that rates were going to go down. We're not sure where rates are going to go under the current plan, but as I said a few minutes ago, we've got a plan, we believe, that will work. We believe that removing the guarantee and Nova Scotia Power's profit saves Nova Scotia ratepayers money. We know that it will. We believe in rewriting the plan that the NDP have put forward, which is not affordable, has to be done. It will save ratepayers money. We believe creating a regional energy market and creating more opportunities to buy the cheapest energy available to us. At the same time, wanting to buy clean energy, green energy, at the best rates that are available to the Nova Scotia ratepayers, Madam Chair. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to touch on that. Right now, in the province of Nova Scotia, people every day hear about the issue of power. You know, and all they see is the power company. I'm trying to think of the right word to use here, Madam Speaker. and I see you're looking at me. And we need to be careful because it needs to be parliamentary. And I can tell you, I'll just say this much, Madam Speaker. When people are talking about Nova Scotia Power and what's going on in this province, they are not using parliamentary language. I can guarantee you that. Because they're upset. And I don't blame them for being upset. And they hear this and they hear that and they don't know what to believe anymore. But what they do believe is looking at their power bill at the end of the month and saying, I can't believe that, how high it has become. Here we are moving into winter. What about the people that are on electric heat? I know they're worrying about January the 1st. You know, we're going to be coming in. We're already at a bit of the season now, coming into winter, and it's getting cool. We know people have their power and their heat on. We want people to go to that clean energy, that greener energy, and electricity is one way to do that. People bought into that a number of years ago, you know, and they installed in their homes electric heat. You know, when they looked at prices of oil and all of those things, they thought the future's probably better off in electricity. It's probably something that should be stable. Well, today they're learning maybe that's not the way to go. So they are out there looking at other alternatives, but the thing is, we can put forward all kinds of grants that, you know, you want to talk about this and that, but there's nothing out there that will cover maybe, what's geothermal run you around 10 grand easy to put in if you were going to do that. Solar's very expensive. If you want to talk about putting programs and investing in Nova Scotians and creating jobs, what about some of those ideas and instilling and putting programs in place and helping people in that way? You know, but individual windmills, my colleague says, yes, well, Madam Speaker, you know, those people, as I was saying, are going to be worried in January. Their bill, you know, 2% might not sound like a lot, or 3% might not sound like a lot. That's $20, $30 on every 100. As we know, most power bills of people that are using electric heat don't have $100 a month power bills. They're considerably higher than that. It's a big jump for these folks. And these are everyday people that are working, as I was saying a few minutes ago. These are single parents, you know, that are working part-time or three-quarter time or permanent part-time or whatever we call it these days. We know that there's a big drop in full-time employment in this province. We know that. The numbers show us that. People will stand here and argue that. We know that's the case. Government will claim that they've done this. Well, we know, yeah, they've created a few part-time jobs, Madam Speaker. We know that. Part-time jobs don't cut it. Part-time jobs in the province of Nova Scotia won't pay the power bill, especially those folks living on electric heat. Whether they have an apartment and they're paying their own bill or whether they have a home, you know, big enough to increase their bill. Longer dark hours, more power being used. We know that there's peaks in our power, but what are we doing about it? We're not doing anything about it. The government refuses. All they're focused on is Newfoundland. Well, maybe they should stop focusing on Newfoundland, Madam Speaker, and start focusing on the province of Nova Scotia, the ratepayers in Nova Scotia. And I'd be willing to bet that everyone in the government caucus has also heard from constituents that we are having trouble paying our power bills. And I can't imagine they're walking in and saying, thank you very much, so-and-so. Thank you very much. Thank you, too. Thanking every member of the government caucus for bringing in the project in Newfoundland that's not maybe ever going to come to fruition. We need to be looking today. We need to be looking yesterday, as a matter of fact, and beyond, for long-term sustainable energy cost, and we're not doing that. The government's focus is solely, unfortunately, on Newfoundland when we don't know that that will ever happen. We don't even know what the costs will be, but yet they can stand here and talk about how this is a good project for Nova Scotia. I can't imagine that the minister can sit down and sign agreements and come to Nova Scotia and tell Nova Scotians that this is a good deal for you. I just can't imagine that a minister of the Crown would sit down and do that and then stand up in his place in this very historic chamber and tell people, this is a good deal for you. I would like that minister, maybe I'll refer my calls to that minister, Madam Speaker, when I get them from now on, and I know I'm going to get them coming into the winter with the power bills going through the roof here. Another 2 or 3% is going to be added on. Maybe I'll just refer them, 1-800 the Minister of Energy. We'll create a new number, a new email address, etc., so that people can get them and they can share their stories themselves about what the reality in Nova Scotia is. There, I see he's got his phone out. Make sure it stays charged, Minister, because I can tell you, the people that are going to be calling you are going to be charged. I know that for a fact. And they feel that they're being more than charged. Matter of fact, they would use the term ripped off. Is that it? Maybe that's not parliamentary, Madam Chair, and if it isn't, I take it back. I retract it, but I'm not sure. But that's how they feel. And I know from talking to them that that's how they feel. So keep that phone charged up, Minister, because they will be more than charged when they're calling. And I think that maybe we're going to need to, maybe the minister's missing it. Maybe he doesn't get those calls. Maybe he thinks everything is wonderful and it's utopia in the minister's office. It's a wonderful world. Wasn't there a movie or something like that? Madam Speaker, I correct that in a hurry. It's important that Nova Scotians focus, that the government, more importantly, focuses and works hard on behalf of all Nova Scotians to do the right thing. And what they're doing today, with the plan that they have in place, trying to meet something that is not affordable. They are making life terrible. They are making life difficult. They are making life more than unaffordable for the ratepayers in the province of Nova Scotia. And with those few words, Madam Speaker, I will take my seat.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today and speak to this bill, the Reliability and Accountability in Electricity Act. First, I want to address a couple things that the minister had talked about. It's funny to hear the minister suggest that the URB already has this authority. Let's not forget this is the same minister that told us that the URB had the authority to review Muskrat Falls, and he was wrong, and they had to introduce legislation to do that, and spent a year saying that the Utility and Review Board had the power to do spending reviews, which it turned out they did not. So I'm not sure how much credibility I can put in the minister's statement when in fact, when this had come up at the board, and when we had actually raised this issue at the board a number of years ago, the board said they didn't have the authority to impose such fines. It doesn't really surprise me, Madam Speaker, because it's very clear that members of the opposition actually don't read the opposition bills, because if they did, they would know that the bill that we tabled, which they keep referring to as deregulation, is exactly what the Deputy Premier was advocating for. And it's interesting, actually, that many of the NDP staffers have now backed off of calling it deregulation in Twitterverse and all those online places, and they're sort of leaving the cabinet hanging out to dry on that issue. So even the staff don't believe it anymore for the most part. So it is interesting. The bill, and if the minister needs a copy of that bill, if there's something wrong, maybe there's a coffee cup has been put on his bill, and so he can't read the bill that we've tabled over 7 times in this legislature, so that the Premier or the Deputy Premier and the member for Halifax-Chiboucto have both previously spoken in favor of, that now suddenly is magically deregulation. I'd be happy to get him a new copy, bound the whole bit. It might make it a bit easier. He might also want to check with his own Department of Energy, which had it recommended through the Electricity Marketplace Governance Committee. He may also want to check his predecessor's comments. The member for, I want to call him the Minister for Transportation, but he's not anymore. For Timberley, the former Minister of Energy. This minister's critic, who in question period 2 years ago also said it wasn't deregulation. So you might want to check your own party's statements on our bill before calling it that. And your own party's statements on that bill, even in the past 3 years since they became government, Madam Speaker. Sorry. Madam Speaker, with that, there are many issues that face the electricity market, and I think we've all heard complaints from residents when the power goes out. And listen, the power is going to go out sometimes. I think, Madam Speaker, I think we all understand that sometimes there's going to be a storm which results in the power going out. There's going to be an incident, but I think we also remember that the Utility and Review Board, among others, conducted a number of reviews of this and found that Nova Scotia Power was wanting in this regard, found that their system reliability was in question. We've seen that We've heard the NDP caucus complain about that before. We've heard the Premier complain about that before. We've heard others complain about that. And this bill is an intent to address that with penalties that cannot be charged back to ratepayers on this, for this, and which will benefit ratepayers. All of the things which these fines can be used for benefit ratepayers, and this is also based on legislation that is working in other places. You know, Madam Speaker, for anybody to be able to stand up and say that they think that Nova Scotia Power should not be held accountable when they ought to or should have been able to deal with a reliability issue, I can't understand how anybody would be able to stand here and say that. The fact is that it is up to Nova Scotia Power to ensure that their system is suitably reliable. At the moment, in many places, they are going for the bare minimum. And I think many members of the legislature, perhaps on all sides, would agree that there are places in this province where the system reliability is not what it should be. And the fact is that we are at the mercy of Nova Scotia Power to put forward a capital plan. And if you read the capital plan that they put forward, I think it was tabled yesterday, but was reported on today, there's very little in there to address the issue of system reliability. There's very little to deal with that problem. And so, Madam Speaker, it is our responsibility to ensure that there is a penalty if Nova Scotia Power system fails at a time that it should have addressed that reliability. It is our responsibility as legislatures to put that power in place so the Utility and Review Board can address that. The minister can stand up and say that they have that authority now. Well, Madam Speaker, I point out again that he said that twice before and he's turned out wrong. He's not yet correctly said once in the time he's been minister that the URB had power that others on this side of the House claim that they didn't. In both cases, he's turned out to be wrong and had to introduce legislation to correct that. So, Madam Speaker, he's got to go back and, check with his department because his own department will tell you that they don't actually have that ability at the moment to do manners like this. And this ensures that these penalties cannot be passed on to ratepayers. So it is an incentive for them to look at this. It creates this, at the moment they look at it and they say, well, it's cheaper to go out and fix the wires. It's cheaper to go out and put them up and leave somebody without power. It's cheaper to say, well, you didn't get the mast back up on your house if you have overhead wires, and we're going to come back and do that. It's cheaper for them to do that than fix the problem up front. Madam Speaker, I think you may have actually been still on council with me at the time when Nova Scotia Power came and to council and talked about, we could look at all the different options they could look at for reliability. I think it might have been our first year on council, Madam Speaker, because I remember we had got on there shortly after the Hurricane Juan had been the year before, and there was White Juan and the whole bit, and they came and said, well, we could do all these things, but it's so expensive. Now, it's so expensive for us to do, this helix cable, or it's so expensive for us to strengthen the towers. Well, fine. They go that, and they say that, and they point out the fact that, well, I'm sorry, that's too expensive. Well, you know what? You have to create a situation where it is more expensive for them to do the wrong thing. And at the moment, the wrong thing is not protecting ratepayers and ensuring that the system is reliable. People are paying a heck of a lot for power, the highest power rates in the country. Or if you want to take Nova Scotia Power's triumph that they're not the highest, it's the second highest according to them. So we sit here, we pay the highest rates, but we don't get anything for it. We don't get the reliability. We don't get the feedback we need from them. And they sit there and they do not have to answer for that. Even if the Utility and Review Board does what they did last time an issue like this comes up and calls and said, well, we're going to do a review. There are no penalties. The review was scathing at the time. Scathing, Madam Speaker, of the reliability and how they responded to those issues. But the fact of the matter was there was nothing the board could do to penalize them for it. So they went through another review. And you know where the costs of that review got passed on to? To ratepayers. The minister stood in his remarks and he said that he's introduced a bill that will reduce the amount of rate hearings that will occur. Well, no, he hasn't. He should actually go back and read his bill. The bill excludes the FAM hearings. It excludes the DSM hearings. It excludes the extraordinary hearings, which are almost all the hearings. He allows a GRA hearing, a rate hearing, every 2 years. Well, Madam Speaker, with the exception of the past 2 years, they've generally only happened every 3 years or further. So he's actually suggesting they have them more frequently than what they were having them on average as it was. So to stand up and suggest that it's reducing the number of hearings, I don't even understand where he comes up with that, because his own bill excludes the vast majority of them. His own bill excludes the hearings which the interveners are complaining most about, which are costing ratepayers most. And they exclude the ones, the minister stood up, and actually the premier stood up in question period today and said that the primary reason for the increases was fuel, and obviously a significant portion of it's fuel, Madam Speaker, but that's the main reason. Well, you know what? The main reason for it was, and they would be just going through the fuel adjustment mechanism hearing. They would not open themselves to a general rate application hearing because they get the increases for fuel, for wind turbines, for biomass, for all those sorts of things without ever having to go to a general rate application. And for the Premier to stand up and say that, knowing that they're in the middle of a general rate application at the moment, shows that the Premier doesn't even understand how that hearing process and understand what his own bill does. And that's a shame. That's honestly a shame that situation exists, because you have to know what's being asked for. It's no different than the minister standing at the board and giving everybody the impression that they were going to do something about this rate increase when in fact they were not. You know, Madam Speaker, there are a number of issues, and there is a number of bills, I'm not sure exactly how many that we have as a caucus on the order paper at the moment, which outline many of the things we've done. This is part of an overall plan, and this addresses the issue which, you know, if we had been hit by Sandy, I could rest assured almost every member here probably would have got calls at some point, you know, but we didn't. We didn't, and that's good. I mean, I know our hearts are with our neighbors to the south, but we didn't get hit with that. But if we had, rest assured, we would have heard from people, and some of it would have been understandable, right? Some of it would have been. But if it was anything like the last major storms we've had, Madam Speaker, we would have learned afterwards that some of it was preventable. 1 minute, Madam Speaker? A bit? Yeah. So, Madam Speaker, there are a number of issues. There are a number of issues that need to be addressed with respect to Nova Scotia Power and how power is dealt with in this province. Madam Speaker, I would encourage the minister to actually sit down and look at this bill, because this is something that I know I've heard members of the NDP caucus talk about before when they were in opposition. I know I've heard them talk about it. In fact, I've stood with them when I was on council and they were in opposition and talked about it. This is a way that we can address it. It's a way that we can ensure that there is an incentive there to ensure that the infrastructure that we have in this power for power delivery is strong, is reliable, and serves people whether they're in the most remote place in this province or the most dense place. And it's our responsibility to make sure that happens. Madam Speaker, I appreciate the House's time to speak to that. And with that, I will recess my remarks.
Adjourn debate. Yeah. Question is to adjourn debate on Bill number 95. All in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion's carried. Recognize the Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. That concludes the official opposition business for today. I'll now turn the floor over to the Government House Leader to give us the hours and the business for tomorrow.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you to the Liberal House Leader. Madam Speaker, after the daily routine tomorrow, we will be calling bills, public bills for second reading. 97, 102, 105, 104, 109, 111, 112, 114, 115, 119. And so, bingo. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. 107? Yes. Thank you.